She was a single mother building a better life for her and her daughter.
My mom definitely looked at Princeton as a fresh start.
Life got easier for her. She was happy.
But a vicious attack would tear her family apart forever.
There were 5 gunshot wounds. The stab wounds were primarily focused on her head. We could tell from that crime scene that she fought to the very end.
Due to the nature of the victim's injuries, everything was on the table. Could this be something that was done just for financial gain? Could this be a jilted lover?
The revelation of a secret affair will uproot one relationship and plant a deadly seed of jealousy in another.
They wanted her out of the way. She gave him an ultimatum. You've got a month to get rid of her.
He couldn't pick, either or. He wanted to have both, and that's not how it works.
You had 2 individuals who, while professing their love for each other, let that so-called love drive them to the point that they were willing to take the life of another human being to keep it going.
It's hard to comprehend how one human being can be so cruel to another. It was the ultimate betrayal.
Close enough to Dallas that some folks can live there and commute to Dallas, but it has a small town feel.
But just after 6 p.m. on September 20th, 2017, the Collin County Sheriff's Office receives a disturbing call about one of the town's residents.
Kadie Graham hadn't heard from her mom, Kelly Underwood, in a few days, and got a little worried, so drove over to her place in Princeton to see what was up.
So I did reach out to her a couple times, and I didn't hear back from her, so that kind of, raised a little suspicion for me, just because we hadn't had an argument. There wasn't a reason for her to be ignoring me or not answering my text messages or my calls or anything like that. So that I did go over there, and as soon as I pulled up, it was kind of like I got just bad vibes completely. I went up the sidewalk, and then I walked up. I knocked on the door for probably like 15 seconds, no answer. But then that last knock, like the door opened. As soon as I walked inside, I called out to her. I was like, "Mom, where are you at?" I walked upstairs. I called out to her. Her craft room door was open. And I saw her feet. I remember walking around her little craft table, and she was just laying there. That's when I noticed, the blood on her head. I remember kneeling down, and as soon as I grazed my hand to move it to go check her pulse, I actually touched her leg, and she was just ice. And that's when I went into major freak out mode.
She was so scared that she didn't want to touch anything or mess anything up. So she had called 911 from back outside the front of the house.
First responders quickly arrive on scene and find a distraught Kadie.
Kadie had described where her mother's body was found, and so they went upstairs to that room specifically, craft room across from the master bedroom.
When they got there, they noticed with this horrific scene, blood around the room, things knocked over. The body had been there for a while, so there was no need to try to resuscitate because obviously Kelly Underwood had passed away.
The way that she was laying, they could tell without even moving her initially that she had possibly suffered stab wounds and gunshot wounds.
Detectives wonder who had done this to Kelly Underwood and why.
One of the difficulties in any murder investigation is going back and trying to piece together exactly how it occurred.
Born and raised in Mesquite, Texas, Kelly Underwood had always been a shining light in her small Texas community.
Kelly had a bubbly personality. She loved to joke around, and she was just always, the fun person in the room.
From an early age, Kelly had big plans for her future.
She would talk about, wanting to get married and have children and have a career, be successful.
Kelly married very soon after high school, and she had our first child.
Unfortunately, that marriage didn't work out, and she remarried another man, Caden's father. They were married a few years, and then unfortunately that didn't work out. She stayed in the Mesquite area and continued working, and it's a balance, it's a struggle for any single mom.
When it came down to it, she was always a very positive person. Anybody that met her would say that, her smile would light up a room. That's just the type of person that she was.
But in May 2001, Kelly was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness.
She had to have surgery for a brain tumor that had been developing for quite some time.
They removed her tumor on her brainstem, and it left a portion of her face a little paralyzed.
There would be days that, I would walk downstairs and she would be like in the bathroom and couldn't feel the left side of her body. And as a teenager, that's really hard to see,
Our whole family supported her and, tried to tell her it didn't matter, that everybody has their own way of dealing with things, and she internalized a lot. She was very depressed.
That's when Kelly decided it was time to make a change.
One of her friends from high school, Tiffany, said, come to Princeton. You can live with us for a while you get settled. We'll see about helping you get a job. Tiffany's husband, Ronnie, had a metal fabrication shop.
Ronnie, his family lived there for decades. Ronnie hung around with, a lot of people that were in the racing circle there in the small town in Princeton. Ronnie offered employment, a place to stay. If you want to come work here, we can, let you stay here with us till you find a place of your own. And that's what she did.
She started working for, Ronnie Welborn at Express Fabrications. She started out being a welder. And I'm pretty sure after about a year and a half, that's when she moved into the office and started handling the, the accounting, the books, and stuff like that. She really handled everything. I mean, she was the face of the company. She was very good at her job.
Kelly also offered her boss, Ronnie, emotional support when his wife filed for divorce in May 2014.
When he and Tiffany were going through the divorce, he would confide in Kelly, and she was there for him. And he was there for her when she was going through a hard time, and she reciprocated. They became really good friends.
Obviously, he was her boss, but he was also a friend. He was a supporter. I mean, he was always one of her biggest fans when it came down to it.
As Ronnie adjusted to his new life, Kelly also became more independent. In the spring of 2017, she moved into a new house in Princeton.
Hayden graduated, she moved in with friends, and Kelly was living alone.
She enjoyed spending time in her backyard, so she wanted to put a pool in the backyard and enjoy and relax when she got home.
My mom definitely looked at Princeton as a fresh start. She was very happy.
But on September 20th, 2017, Princeton police have been called to Kelly's home, where the 46-year-old has been found brutally murdered.
Princeton was a small town. It had crime, but it had not had a murder for 20 or 25 years.
None of their detectives had ever investigated a homicide. And so they had the foresight to call the Texas Rangers to help them with that investigation.
It was apparent from the moment our investigators walked into the room that she had lost her life in a violent way and in a struggle. Our investigators looked at it through the lens of, could this be a jilted lover? Could this be something that was done just for financial gain. Everything was on the table.
Coming up, homicide investigators find evidence that suggests possible persons of interest.
It looked like people had been hanging out after they've murdered her. It's absolutely disgusting.
It led us to believe that we had two perpetrators instead of just one person doing the crime.
And the search for clues will lead police to uncover an unexpected relationship.
There would be text messages where they were telling each other they loved each other, and then a couple days later, they were in a heated argument.
In Princeton, Texas, 46-year-old single mother Kelly Underwood has been found brutally murdered in her home. Detectives are meticulously processing the crime scene in order to help piece together what happened.
We collected 5 .22 spent cartridge cases in the craft room.
Kelly had a gunshot wound to her ankle. She had a couple gunshot wounds to her left upper arm, but she also had 2 gunshot wounds that had pierced her chest. The stab wounds were primarily focused on her head. So she had one through her right temple, she had one that entered her skull, and she had a couple in her neck. She also had some other, what they called superficial or incise wounds that really didn't penetrate deeply, but were clearly from the same sharp object.
It's not very common for someone to use 2 different weapons on a victim, and therefore in this case it at least led us to believe that we had 2 perpetrators instead of just one person doing the crime.
As Kelly's body is removed for autopsy, investigators continue to process the rest of the home for clues.
In her bedroom, we found her cell phone.
In modern day investigations, cell phones are invaluable. We all live with our cell phones, we all use our cell phones. If you want to know anything about someone, you can pretty much figure it out with a cell phone.
Next, investigators make their way downstairs, where Kelly's 19-year-old daughter, Kadie Graham, helps them to identify additional clues.
You go into the living room, which the front door opens up into, and there's areas that looks a bit chaotic. Over in the corner, there was an obvious disturbance where the surveillance equipment was pulled out, and it just looked like it had been yanked out and just thrown on the floor.
Nothing else appears to have been stolen, so investigators dismiss robbery as a likely motive.
What was interesting about this crime scene was we didn't see entry being made through a broken door or broken window. It looked like it was someone who had been invited in.
Now, there were used plates and utensils on the counter.
That was unusual to Kadie and stood out.
My mom was very OCD. Everything, when it came down to her, it was clean, clean, clean. She didn't like anything being dirty.
Kadie quickly points out another inconsistency.
When we went out into the backyard, photographed it, looked like, people had been hanging out back there as well. We collected some cigarette butts.
My mom didn't smoke cigarettes either, so that was another thing that I was like, she would not be okay with cigarette butts being, sprawled out all throughout her backyard.
It looked like, people had hung out there after they've murdered her. That tells you the lack of conscience they have, the lack of respect for life as a whole that they have. And it's absolutely disgusting.
Those were obviously important pieces of evidence for us to try to collect and also get tested for possible DNA evidence.
The following day, the Collin County medical examiner performs an autopsy to recover more evidence.
Scrapings were taken from underneath Kelly's fingernails, and that was preserved and passed forward for DNA.
Based on the rigor mortis, the window of death was somewhere in the late evening of September 16th to the very early morning hours of September 17th.
After the autopsy, investigators conduct an extended interview with Kadie Graham.
Any good murder investigation is going to leave no stone unturned, and if you start off without looking at everyone as a suspect, then you do a disservice to the case.
They sat Kadie down, questioned her, checking for an alibi for her.
Kadie told them we may have our fights, but I talked to her often, and we were in a good place. I had just called her the Friday before to tell her that I was going to be looking for a new job, and she was talking me through it and supporting me. And so when I didn't hear from her for a couple days, I just finally went over there to check on her.
They asked to look at her cell phone, any communications with our victim, and she willingly complied.
They immediately started looking in her phone and saw that Kadie had tried to get in touch with her mom more than once in the days of September 15th and September 16th, which was the Friday and Saturday before she was deceased.
Police asked Kadie for a detailed account of her whereabouts over the past few days.
Kadie had been living with a family close by, a friend and her parents. Kadie also had a boyfriend at the time, and so the Rangers did every follow-up that they needed to. The Rangers asked consent of that family to search the home to see if they could find a matching murder weapon. They did not find any murder weapon that would have matched the one that killed Kelly, which was specifically a .22 caliber.
Based on the victim's daughter's cell phone records, based on other witnesses, and based on the time of the offense, it became very clear that she was not involved in this offense.
At the beginning, I did feel that they were a little too focused on me and asking me too many questions, and it did raise a little bit of worry. I would never do this. I would never hurt her. Over a certain period of time, they were like, okay, we know that you had nothing to do with it, and we thank you for, working with us and being understanding. That was my main thing, was making sure that I did everything that they asked, just to make sure that they found the right people, that they weren't focused on the wrong people.
Investigators begin canvassing Kelly Underwood's neighborhood, searching for anyone who can speak to her final days.
Investigators with the Princeton Police Department and the Texas Rangers asked neighbors if they had seen any individuals out of the ordinary over at the house. There was a neighbor that reported last seeing Kelly was a white male who drove a truck with Illinois license plates. The neighbors had also described a black male who had been over there in the garage helping with work on September 16th, the dates that we believe that our murder happened.
But who were these two men? And what connection, if any, could they possibly have to Kelly's murder? In order to find out, police know they have to find both men, and fast.
They obviously wanted to speak with them. What had happened? What did they know?
In the days after, 46-year-old Kelly Underwood was found murdered in her Princeton, Texas home. Investigators have learned about two men seen at Kelly's home in the time frame they believe she was killed. Unfortunately, none of the neighbors are able to identify the men by name, but they believe the men were there to work on Kelly's house.
Kelly had some things, she wanted done around the house. She needed her pool put in, and she was having problems with her cameras at home and wanted them replaced.
Hoping to identify the two workers, investigators reach out to Kelly's associates. They start with her boss and close friend, Ronnie Welborn, who appears devastated by the news of her murder.
It absolutely was a shock to Ronnie. They were very close.
Ronnie was like mental support throughout the whole situation. I mean, from when I found her up until the funeral. When I went up to the funeral home to, make arrangements and everything. He was very adamant about being a part of it. He wanted to make sure that I had support and that I didn't feel alone.
When investigators meet with Ronnie, he quickly offers them a crucial lead.
He did know that she was getting some work done in her backyard, and he provided the name of Robert Veal as the person who was helping her do that work in her backyard.
Robert Veal was an old friend of Ronnie's, a racing buddy, had worked for Ronnie for a while, and Kelly was well aware of him also.
Unfortunately, Ronnie says he doesn't know who the second man that neighbors had reported seeing at the home could be. When their calls to Robert Veal go unanswered, investigators examine Kelly Underwood's phone records, searching for information that will help to identify the second worker. But what they discover points the case in a whole new direction.
So at that time, the Rangers had reviewed Kelly's phone and saw that there was some sort of romantic relationship, not just a business relationship, between Kelly and Ronnie. There would be text messages where they were telling each other they loved each other, and Ronnie couldn't wait to make her Mrs. Welborn.
But texts reveal that Kelly and Ronnie's romance had also been quite volatile.
A couple days later, they were in a heated argument. And, Kelly never wanted to see him again.
Investigators ask Kelly's daughter, Kadie, about the relationship. She confirms her mother and Ronnie had had an on-again, off-again romance going back to when Ronnie and his wife had split 3 years earlier.
He was showing up to the house a lot more. We were going to do stuff with him and going to dinners and shopping, and that's when I kind of picked up on this is kind of becoming more than a friendship.
Kelly hid the relationship that she had with Ronnie from the family. Kelly worked for Ronnie, and she knew that, it's probably not the right thing to do, dating your boss. So no one really knew about it except for Kadie, and Kadie kept it a secret as well.
Kadie also claims to know why her mother's relationship with Ronnie was so tumultuous.
I told him Kadie Robinson. Like, that's the main person that came to my head.
Kadie says one weekend at the races, Ronnie met this young woman named Kadie, a sweet Texas girl from Pilot Point, Texas. She was 20 years younger than him, but apparently they hit it off.
They developed a relationship, and Kadie became pregnant, and Kadie ended up moving in with Ronnie. This all was happening simultaneously with the relationship with Kelly, and then Kelly found out about it.
She actually wanted to leave the company. She didn't want to work for Ronnie any longer, but Ronnie really didn't want to lose her because she was good at what she did.
Kadie tells police that her mother eventually came to terms with the situation. She even tried to befriend Ronnie's new girlfriend.
We actually bought her gifts for her baby, and my mom went to go drop it off to her. And at that time, my mom did end the relationship with Ronnie, and she did apologize and, for, kind of like any overstepping that happened because Kadie was pregnant.
Despite Kelly's attempt to make peace, Kadie never took kindly to Ronnie's ongoing relationship with a former lover.
He couldn't pick, either or. He wanted to have both, and that's not how it worked.
According to Kadie, the situation came to a head 1 week before her mother's murder.
When Ronnie was at work every day at the shop, Kadie would take his oldest daughter to school, and she could see Kelly's front door, her sidewalk, and her street from the parent drop-off loop. About a week before Kelly's death, she sees Ronnie's truck at Kelly's house, and she becomes furious.
Kadie came over to Kelly's house, and in the front yard, there was a very loud verbal altercation. Two Texas women butting heads hard.
My mom did come outside and tell her, to get off her property. Kadie did cuss at her and stuff like that. More so try to instigate something to where my mom would do something, but my mom didn't do anything physical. She just, got loud with her and was like, I don't show up to your house like this. It's very disrespectful. And then Kadie did get in her vehicle and leave.
Police can't help but wonder, could the heated love triangle have resulted in Kelly Underwood's murder?
Because of the nature of the crime itself. We had a crime that was a violent killing, and to find out that the boss was having a relationship with our victim changed the dynamic in the way we looked at him.
Coming up, as investigators unravel a tense romantic rivalry, Kelly's daughter chases a potential lead and catches a major break.
There are some individuals who prefer not to speak to law enforcement, so Kadie took it upon herself to go out.
I felt that I needed answers, and I just needed to know, what happened.
Days after Kelly Underwood was found dead in her Princeton, Texas home, investigators have discovered that Kelly was having an affair with her close friend and boss, Ronnie Welborn. They immediately bring him in for another round of questioning and confront him with the new information.
Ronnie comes clean. He says that after his breakup with his wife, Tiffany, and the divorce, he was single and lonely. Kelly was single and lonely. They got together, and they have been seeing each other for a few years. Ronnie says that he loves Kelly, that he sees her regularly, even though he has Kadie Robinson living with him.
He told investigators that he had actually been over there about midday Friday, September 15th, the day before Kelly's murder, seen her alive, actually helped her move some sort of storage chest in her garage, and that was the last time that he saw her.
Ronnie provides investigators with an alibi, which they quickly verify.
Investigators then, of course, wanted to interview Kadie. She was forthcoming that she did not like Kelly, that she knew of this secret relationship.
Kadie was asked about the confrontation. She described it as, more traumatic for her, right? That she's just trying to figure out what the father of her child is doing at this other woman's house, and she gets confronted and yelled at and pretty scared.
Like Ronnie, Kadie also insists that she has no idea what happened to Kelly Underwood or why.
While they admitted the fact that the relationship between Kelly and Ronnie was a friction point for their relationship, they quickly told investigators that that was no reason why anyone should lose their life. In a million years, they wouldn't have wanted that to happen to someone.
Kadie also provides investigators with a verifiable alibi. With no reason to hold the couple, investigators next focus their efforts on tracking down Ronnie's former employee, Robert Veal.
We actually had trouble finding Robert Veal. We believe he was trying to run from the police.
At the same time, Kelly's daughter, Kadie Graham, does some investigating of her own.
I felt that I needed answers, and I just needed to know, what happened. So I went to, neighbors' houses.
There are some individuals who prefer not to speak to law enforcement, may have their own rough past with law enforcement, and they weren't getting any concrete information from some of those neighbors. So Kadie took it upon herself to go out and talk to one of the neighbors who had described a black male being across the street at Kelly's house. The neighbor actually knew the black male because they had spent some time together in county jail.
He only knew the nickname that he went by, and he told me that he went by D.
Kadie was able to pull up a Facebook photo to identify who D was as Delvin Powell. And then she passed that information along back to the Texas Rangers. When they ran the information for Delvin Powell, they found that Delvin had an outstanding warrant for an unrelated domestic violence charge. They found him through his girlfriend at the time. She had been reached out to and contacted, and ultimately they were tracked back to a motel in the Princeton area.
Police take Delvin Powell into custody on the outstanding warrant for assault. They also search his hotel room for any evidence that might connect him to Kelly Underwood's brutal murder.
When investigators searched the hotel room, they found a bag, and in that bag there were knives, and there was also a container of .22 caliber ammunition.
The exact same caliber that was used to kill Kelly Underwood. Same brand, same caliber.
Back at the station, police press Delvin Powell about the murder of Kelly Underwood, hoping to get a confession.
They confronted Delvin with the fact that he had been at the house, and he admitted to as much. He said that he was there helping Robert with the work on Kelly's house, but he didn't really know Kelly, didn't really interact with her directly. His story was, the last time I saw her on September 16th, she was alive.
Investigators obtain a warrant to take DNA samples from Delvin. They keep him in custody while they continue their search for Robert Veal. Then, on September 28th, authorities catch a break when an informant notifies them that Robert's truck has been spotted outside his house.
Texas Rangers and investigators went to the home of Robert Veal to talk to him about what he knew.
Authorities immediately take Robert into custody and transport him to headquarters. In an interrogation room, investigators press Robert about his truck being spotted at Kelly's house the day she was murdered.
Robert Veal admitted, I was doing work for her. Yes, I knew her. I was in her house. The last time I saw her was September 16th, and in fact, I've tried to call her and get in touch with her since because she wasn't answering me. He didn't really have a good explanation for, okay, if you'd been over at her house every day, sometimes for multiple hours a day, sometimes all day doing this work, why didn't you ever call police when she never responded to you? Why didn't you try to figure out what happened to her? He didn't have a good answer for that.
As the interview continues, Veal's behavior becomes increasingly suspicious.
They notice him start to manipulate his phone underneath his chair. They are worried that he is trying to destroy evidence right in front of them.
The Rangers immediately grabbed him and seized that cell phone as he attempted to erase information from it.
Investigators examine the remaining contents in Robert Veal's cell phone and are surprised to find a series of incoming text messages from Ronnie Welborn's girlfriend, Kadie Robinson.
Kadie is demanding Robert to call her, asking what is going on. Robert and Kadie didn't have any kind of prior relationship that they should be communicating at all.
Despite their suspicions, the text messages alone aren't enough evidence to keep Robert Veal in custody. Before releasing him, they take DNA samples from Robert and continue building their case against the 4 suspects. Then, while they wait for results from the crime lab, investigators receive an unexpected call about Kadie Robinson.
Texas Rangers received a tip from a woman who used to work with Kadie, said that she had recently had lunch with her, and Kadie just said something kind of odd to her. Kadie had essentially said that she was glad that Kelly was gone.
On November 15th, investigators arrange another interview with Kadie Robinson.
At this point, they let her know, we know more than you think we do. It's time to come clean.
And she ultimately gave information that only somebody who was involved with this crime and planning this crime would know.
Two months after the murder of Kelly Underwood, Kadie Robinson has agreed to cooperate with investigators and immediately implicates her boyfriend, Ronnie Welborn, as the man responsible for Kelly's death. Kadie claims that Ronnie had hired 34-year-old Robert Veal to commit the crime. But she swears she had nothing to do with the conspiracy herself.
Kadie admitted that there was a plan, but Kadie's take at this time was, I wasn't involved. She painted the picture that these other three people had gotten rid of Kelly. Texas Rangers, they of course brought Ronnie Welborn right back in to discuss the latest take on what was happening.
It wasn't an aggressive interview by the Texas Rangers. It was just, we know now. We know exactly what happened. We know more. And this is now your opportunity to come clean. And he did. What Ronnie tells investigators is that he had offered Robert Veal $8,000. He provided Robert Veal a .22 caliber firearm the morning of Kelly's murder.
Robert Veal was the kind of person who, while he was more than willing to commit a murder, didn't want to do it alone. And he brought his friend Delvin Powell in to commit the murder with him.
Based on the evidence, detectives theorize that on the morning of September 16th, Robert and Delvin arrived at Kelly's house under the guise that they were there to build her pool.
She had been upstairs in the craft room when they decided to come upstairs and attack her because she had no way out.
She tried to fight them off, and they shot her, and they stabbed her. She begged for them to stop, and they looked her in the eye as they took her life.
And then the perpetrators went downstairs. Evidence shows they had a meal. They smoked some cigarettes at some time and sort of just chilled out with this person they have just murdered upstairs.
Asked why he'd put a hit out on Kelly, Ronnie claims he was tired of the drama brewing between the two women in his life. He also insists that his girlfriend, Kadie Robinson, had nothing to do with the murder.
Ronnie took all of the responsibility. He tried to distance Kadie from actually participating, even trying to claim that she really knew nothing about the murder, which ultimately we didn't believe.
Following his confession, investigators arrest Ronnie and continue building their case against Kadie Robinson. When they receive Kadie's cell phone records, their suspicions are confirmed.
Ronnie was physically and emotionally involved with two very headstrong Texas women. Kadie had a child with him, so about a month before the murder, Kadie gave him an ultimatum.
On August 18th, she tells him that he has 1 month till September 18th to figure out a way to get Kelly out of their lives.
Kadie was sending texts to Ronnie Welborn saying, your time's running out, I'm going to take the kid and go.
Ronnie thought that his only apparent way out was to kill Kelly.
In November 2017, all 4 suspects are charged with capital murder. Kelly's friends and family are both relieved and stunned.
I was just kind of like, no, there's no way. Like, you know, he was my mom's best friend. He would never do anything to hurt us. No person that has a heart would ever in a million years do that to somebody that they love.
It was the ultimate betrayal. It's hard to comprehend how one human being can be so cruel to another.
In late 2019 and early 2020, Delvin Powell and Robert Veal are separately tried and convicted for the murder of Kelly Underwood.
Ultimately, the forensic DNA that we received back from our Texas Department of Public Safety crime lab was that Robert Veal's DNA was confirmed on one of the utensils found in Kelly's kitchen, and so was Delvin Powell's DNA confirmed on one of those utensils. Delvin Powell's DNA was also on one of the cigarette butts. Additionally, there was DNA found consistent with Delvin's male DNA profile underneath Kelly's fingernails.
Robert and Delvin are both sentenced to life without parole. In October 2020, Ronnie Welborn pleads guilty to avoid his own trial.
We were informed by his attorneys that he was willing to do the right thing, accept responsibility, plead guilty, and accept a sentence of life in prison.
A few months later, Kadie Robinson also takes a plea bargain.
Ultimately, we determined that the right result in her case was a plea of guilty to 30 years in prison.
That one didn't sit well with me at all. The driving force behind the murders was Kadie Robinson, 100%. Without her constant connection with both Ronnie and Robert Veal, my sister would still be here today.
I do feel that Kadie was the mastermind, but also Ronnie had a role in that as well, because he did provide the money and you know, the weapon that was used. But none of it would have happened if it wasn't for Kadie.
One of the particularly scary issues with this case was the fact that you had two individuals who, while professing their love for each other, let that so-called love drive them to the point that they were willing to take the life of another human being to keep it going. It's scary that there's individuals out there like this.
It took me a lot of time to process Kelly's death. Even now, there are times when it doesn't seem real that she's gone.
I want her to be remembered by being that, you know, that lady that helped everybody when they needed it, or she was always happy. She always had a smile on her face.
The laughter that, you know, she would create and the fun of being around her, she'll be missed forever.
12 years can make a murder disappear. Not from the memory of a family, not from a police file, but from the headlines. In San Francisco, where millions of people move through the streets every year, some killings become statistics almost as quickly as they happen. A gunshot, a flashing ambulance, yellow crime scene tape, a name printed in the newspaper, then silence. But there was a series of murders in the Mission District that refused to stay separate. 7 killings. Years of violence. Rival gang territory. Drug trafficking. Retaliation. And men who, according to federal prosecutors, believed that fear was a form of power. The story centered on an enterprise identified by prosecutors as the 19th Street 16th Street Serenos. Its territory was concentrated around San Francisco's Mission District, with one faction associated with an area between 19th Street and 16th Street, Folsom Street and Dolores Street, and another centered around 16th Street and Mission Street. The violence stretched beyond a single block, beyond a single victim, beyond a single night. And eventually, investigators would connect killings committed years apart. But in the beginning, there was no grand federal indictment. There were only bodies. And questions. Who fired the gun? Why was that person targeted? Was the victim actually a gang member? Was the shooting retaliation? Was somebody watching? Was somebody afraid to talk? Those questions became harder with every passing year. Because a murder investigation is not simply about finding a weapon. It is about finding a chain. A chain of people. A chain of motives. A chain of decisions. And in a gang-controlled environment, investigators can face a wall of silence that is stronger than concrete. Witnesses may disappear. People move. Memories change. Evidence deteriorates. And suspects learn. They learn what police ask. They learn which names investigators are interested in. They learn how long a case can remain unsolved. That is what made the San Francisco Serenos investigation so significant. According to the federal indictment unsealed in April 2018, prosecutors alleged that the enterprise had used violence to defend territory, attack suspected rival gang members, maintain its reputation, and support criminal activity including drug trafficking and robbery. The indictment describes 7 murders in San Francisco and Richmond between 2006 and 2013. The dates were separated by months, sometimes years. But investigators believed the killings were connected by something much more dangerous than coincidence. Loyalty. Revenge. And the logic of the street. The first years of the story were the hardest. Because the city did not see one giant conspiracy. It saw individual crimes. One shooting here. Another shooting there. A body found after dark. A victim collapsing on a neighborhood street. A family receiving a phone call that would divide their lives into before and after. The killers did not need a battlefield. They had streets. Corners. Cars. Apartments. Parks. Parties. Places where ordinary people went about ordinary lives. That was part of the terror. The violence could appear suddenly. One moment a neighborhood was alive. The next, gunfire. And then people running. Doors closing. Phones ringing. Police arriving. The city moving again. That pattern is especially visible in one of the killings prosecutors later attributed to the enterprise. On March 14, 2006, according to Jonathan Aguilar's later plea agreement, Aguilar and other gang members carried out a shooting in which 2 people were killed and 2 others were targeted but survived. Aguilar would eventually plead guilty to federal charges connected to the criminal enterprise and the murders. But in 2006, there was no way to know how far the case would travel. There was no way to know that more than a decade later, federal investigators would return to the killings. There was no way to know that old evidence would become important again. And there was certainly no way for the victims' families to know that the answers would take years. 12 years is a long time. For a child, it can mean growing into adulthood. For a parent, it can mean watching birthdays pass without a loved one. For investigators, it can mean opening a file that has been closed so many times that the paper itself becomes part of the history. But cold cases have a strange quality. They can appear dead. Then suddenly they move. A name surfaces. A witness speaks. A suspect talks. A conspiracy begins to unravel. And sometimes the most important evidence is not discovered at the crime scene. It is discovered years later, when somebody who once believed the truth could remain buried realizes that it cannot. That was the road investigators eventually followed. The 19th Street 16th Street Serenos were described by prosecutors as an association of affiliated Sereno gangs operating in the Mission District. The indictment alleged that members recognized the authority of the Mexican Mafia prison gang and used violence against rivals, particularly Norteño gangs. The alleged motive was not always personal. That distinction mattered. A killing could be ordered or carried out because of territory. Because someone was believed to be a rival. Because retaliation was demanded. Because an earlier shooting had created a debt. And once violence becomes retaliation, the original reason can disappear. One shooting produces another. Then another. The dead become evidence. The living become suspects. And the streets become a ledger written in blood. Investigators eventually began looking at the murders differently. Not as isolated cases, but as pieces of a larger structure. That change in perspective can transform a cold case. A single murder may have only a few suspects, but a criminal enterprise can have dozens of connections. Friends, relatives, associates, drug customers, lookouts, drivers, gunmen, people who know something, people who know someone who knows something, and people who believe that silence is survival. The investigation would eventually involve the San Francisco Police Department, Homeland Security Investigations, and federal prosecutors. But the breakthrough did not arrive overnight. It came after years of work. The federal case was formally revealed in 2018. 10 alleged members were charged. 6 were arrested during a coordinated operation. A 7th was already in Santa Clara County Jail. 3 others were in federal custody. The operation involved law enforcement agencies working across jurisdictions. And suddenly, the murders that had haunted San Francisco for more than a decade were back in the headlines. The old cases were no longer just old cases. They were evidence of an alleged criminal enterprise. The 7 murders described in the indictment had occurred between 2006 and 2013. That meant the youngest cases were already years old. The oldest had been waiting more than a decade. For families, the announcement carried a brutal mixture of emotions. Relief, anger, shock, and the question that always follows an arrest after years of silence. Why did it take so long? There is no simple answer. Cold cases rarely have one. Sometimes the evidence is incomplete. Sometimes witnesses are unwilling to cooperate. Sometimes investigators have to prove not only who pulled the trigger, but why the crime happened and who else was involved. And sometimes the people involved have spent years trying to make sure nobody talks. But federal prosecutors were no longer looking at a single shooting. They were building a picture. A picture of territory, weapons, drug activity, retaliation, gang identity, and alleged murders that had once seemed disconnected. That picture would become the central argument of the case. Yet one fact remained impossible to escape. People had died long before the arrests. Their families had waited. The neighborhood had changed. The streets had changed. The suspects had grown older. Some had accumulated new convictions. Some had entered prison. Some had continued their lives. But the victims remained frozen in the years when they were killed. That is the cruel mathematics of a cold case. Time moves forward for everyone except the dead. And in San Francisco, investigators were about to prove that time does not necessarily erase a murder. Sometimes it only makes the eventual reckoning more dramatic. Because the case was not finished. Not even close. The federal indictment was only the moment when the public finally saw how investigators had connected the pieces. Behind those pages were years of police work. Interviews. Records. Surveillance. Evidence. Names. Relationships. And allegations that reached across the Mission District and into Richmond. The killings were no longer 7 separate mysteries. They had become one enormous story. A story about a gang structure. A story about revenge. A story about fear. And a story about what happens when investigators refuse to let a cold case remain cold. For 12 years, the past had been waiting. Then in 2018, the doors opened. And the arrests began. Part 2. At approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, the past came knocking. Homes were surrounded. Agents moved in. Handcuffs closed. Names that had existed for years inside police files suddenly became national news. The arrests in April 2018 were not the beginning of the investigation. They were the moment the public finally saw its scale. Federal authorities announced that 10 alleged members of the 19th Street 16th Street Serenos had been charged in connection with 7 murders committed between 2006 and 2013. Prosecutors described the organization as a racketeering enterprise operating in and around San Francisco's Mission District. For investigators, the case represented something larger than 7 murders. It represented a pattern. The alleged pattern was brutally simple. Find a rival. Hunt the rival. Shoot. Disappear. Wait. And retaliate again. The indictment described members participating in what prosecutors called hunting for rival or suspected rival gang members. That word is important because it changes the image of a murder. A random shooting is one thing. A deliberate search for someone is another. It suggests planning, movement, communication, a decision to find a particular person. And when investigators began reconstructing years of violence, they were not merely asking who fired a gun. They were asking who decided that someone should die. That distinction would become crucial. The Mission District had long been a neighborhood where cultures, families, businesses, and generations collided. But behind the ordinary movement of city life, prosecutors alleged that gangs were competing for territory and influence. The 19th Street and 16th Street Serenos were described as allied factions. Their principal rivals included Norteño gangs. That rivalry was not abstract. Could determine where someone could stand. Who could enter a neighborhood? Who could sell drugs? Who could claim allegiance? And who could become a target? For residents, the danger was not always obvious. Person could be walking home, standing outside, attending a party, waiting somewhere with friends, and suddenly become part of a conflict they did not understand. One of the cases that eventually became central to the prosecution involved the September 4, 2008 shooting. According to federal prosecutors, Eddie Urbina admitted that he and others killed 2 people and attempted to kill a third in retaliation for the murder of a fellow Sereno earlier that same day. Think about the speed of that cycle. A Sereno is killed. Hours later, according to the government's account, another attack occurs. 2 people die. Another survives. One murder creates another crime scene. The streets become a sequence of reactions. And every reaction creates another reason for revenge. That is how gang violence can become self-perpetuating. The original victim is almost forgotten. The next victim becomes the new reason. Then another. And another. By the time investigators arrive years later, the motive can resemble a maze. Who started it? Who ordered what? Who knew? Who lied? Who was acting independently? Who was following instructions? And who was simply standing nearby when someone decided to pull the trigger? Those questions cannot be answered by a single piece of evidence. They require reconstruction. Investigators have to rebuild time itself. Where was each person? Who was speaking to whom? Which vehicle was nearby? Which weapon appeared? Which phone number connected 2 suspects? Which witness changed a story? Which suspect suddenly disappeared? The deeper the investigation went, the more the old murders began to overlap. A suspect in one case might know a suspect in another. A witness might have information about 2 killings. A drug transaction might explain a relationship that seemed unrelated to a murder. A previous shooting might explain a later retaliation. The cases began to form a web. And webs are difficult to see when you examine only one thread. That was the power of the federal racketeering case. Instead of treating every murder as an isolated event, prosecutors could present the alleged enterprise as a structure. The government's theory was that violence served the interests of the organization. It protected territory. It intimidated rivals. It maintained reputation. It supported illegal business. And it created fear. The alleged criminal enterprise did not exist only because people committed crimes. It existed, prosecutors argued, because the crimes reinforced one another. That made the old murders suddenly relevant. The past became evidence. The silence became part of the story. And every suspect had to confront a new reality. Investigators were no longer looking at one incident. They were looking at everything. The 2018 indictment named 10 defendants. Among them was Jonathan Aguilar, also known as Trumpo. Prosecutors alleged that he was involved in 2 murders. His later plea agreement provided an even more detailed picture. Aguilar admitted that on March 14, 2006, he and other gang members carried out a shooting that killed 2 people and attempted to kill 2 others. He also admitted involvement in another shooting in September 2007 and acknowledged drug trafficking activity connected to the enterprise. The significance was enormous. A murder that had once been a local tragedy now appeared inside a federal case spanning years. But even then, there was a difficult question. Why did it take so long? Why did the case remain unresolved for years? The answer is partly hidden in the nature of gang investigations. Witness cooperation can be difficult. People may fear retaliation. Some witnesses may themselves have criminal histories. Others may not trust police. And some may know exactly what happened but believe that speaking will make them the next target. A cold case can survive because everyone who knows the truth is afraid of the consequences of telling it. Then something changes. Sometimes a suspect is arrested for another crime. Sometimes a witness decides to cooperate. Sometimes federal investigators bring resources that local investigators did not previously have. Sometimes a defendant begins talking because the evidence becomes overwhelming. And sometimes people who believed they were protected by the passage of time discover that time has not protected them at all. That appears to be what happened in this case. The arrests were followed by years of litigation. The defendants faced federal charges. The government continued building its case. And the families waited again. Because an arrest is not a conviction. A charge is not proof. A defendant is not a guilty person until the legal process establishes guilt. That distinction matters. Especially in a case involving allegations as serious as murder and racketeering. But eventually the courtroom story changed. In October 2023, 6 defendants pleaded guilty to offenses connected to the enterprise and the 7 cold case murders. Their admissions transformed the case. The government no longer had to prove every allegation through a full trial against each man. Instead, the defendants acknowledged their roles. The cold case had finally begun producing definitive answers. But the answers were not clean. There was no single mastermind standing alone in the center of the story. There was a network. A group of people whose lives had intersected through gang affiliation, crime and violence. And every guilty plea revealed another piece. Jonathan Aguilar. Eddie Urbina. Orlando Hernandez. Weston Venegas. Juan Carlos Gallardo. Mario Reyes. 6 names. 6 different paths. 1 enterprise. 7 murders. Years of violence. And sentences that would eventually stretch across decades. The courtroom was now carrying the weight of streets that had been silent for years. But the most disturbing question remained. How many people had known? How many people had watched the violence? How many had heard the names of the killers? How many had heard gunshots and stayed behind closed doors? How many families had waited for justice while the people responsible continued living? The answer may never be known. Because a criminal case can prove crimes. It cannot always reconstruct every secret. That is the shadow left behind by a cold case. Even after convictions, even after prison sentences, there can still be unanswered questions. And there can still be victims whose stories never receive the same attention as the killers. That is why the 7 murders matter. Not because they created a dramatic federal case, but because each murder began with a human life. Someone who had a family. Someone whose absence became permanent. Someone whose last day became the first page of a case file. The federal government later described the Sereno Enterprise as an organization that had terrorized the Mission District through shootings, robberies, and drug dealing. But terror is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet after gunfire. Sometimes it is a mother waiting for a son who will never come home. Sometimes it is a witness looking through a window and deciding not to speak. Sometimes it is a detective opening an old file and realizing that the person who committed the crime may still be walking free. For 12 years, these murders existed in that space. Between memory and evidence. Between suspicion and proof. Between fear and justice. Then the federal investigation broke the silence. And when it did, it revealed that the old killings were not forgotten. They had been waiting. Part 3. The Mission District does not look like a crime scene. That may be the most unsettling part. There are restaurants, apartment buildings, bus stops, small businesses, people walking dogs, people carrying groceries, children going to school, cars moving through intersections, life continuing at full speed. And somewhere inside that ordinary landscape, 7 people had been killed. The streets did not remember for them. People did. Families did. Investigators did. And eventually the federal government did. The case stretched across 2 California cities. San Francisco. Richmond. The locations were different. The victims were different. The dates were different. But prosecutors believed the same criminal enterprise connected them. The term cold case can create the impression that nothing is happening. That is rarely true. A cold case may simply mean that the evidence has not yet produced an arrest or conviction. Behind the scenes, files can remain active. Names can remain in databases. Old reports can be reviewed. New investigators can examine evidence through a different lens. Technology can change. Witnesses can change. Suspects can change. And sometimes the passage of time itself becomes an investigative tool. People who were once teenagers become adults. Friends become enemies. Gang members fall out. Relationships collapse. Someone goes to prison. Someone becomes angry. Someone wants a deal. Someone decides that carrying another person's secret is no longer worth the price. That is when an old murder can suddenly breathe again. The federal investigation into the 19th Street, 16th Street Serenos was built over years. The government ultimately alleged that the enterprise had been involved in drug trafficking, robbery, and violent attacks, including murders. The indictment described violence against suspected rival gang members. The word suspected matters. Gang cases can be driven by assumptions about identity. A person may be targeted because someone believes they belong to a rival gang. That belief can be enough to make them a target. And once a person is labeled a rival, the label can become more important than the truth. This was one of the central dynamics behind the alleged violence. The streets were governed by perception. Who belonged? Who did not? Who could be trusted? Who could not? who was believed to have crossed a line, and who needed to pay for it. The March 2006 shooting described in Aguilar's plea agreement demonstrates how quickly multiple victims could become part of a single attack. 2 people were killed. 2 others were targeted but survived. The difference between life and death may have been measured in seconds. A doorway. A vehicle. A movement. A weapon malfunction. Person running. Person ducking. Every survivor became a living piece of evidence. But survivors also carry trauma. And trauma changes memory. It can make certain details crystal clear. It can erase others. Investigators have to work around that. They have to compare statements. Check timelines. Test physical evidence. Look for contradictions. And determine whether a witness is telling the truth, protecting someone, or simply remembering events differently after years have passed. That is why cold case investigations can take so long. The truth is rarely sitting neatly inside one witness statement. It is scattered. A fragment here. Fragment there. A name in one report. A vehicle in another. A nickname in a third. Then a connection. Then another. Until the picture begins to form. The 2018 federal indictment was that picture. It alleged that 10 men were part of the enterprise. 9 were alleged to have been directly involved in at least one murder. The 10th was alleged to have helped plan a hunt that led to one of the killings. That allegation changed the scale of the story. This was not simply about gunmen. It was about organization, planning, participation, and the infrastructure surrounding violence. A person does not have to pull a trigger to become important in a murder investigation. A driver can matter. A lookout can matter. A planner can matter. Someone who supplies a weapon can matter. Someone who identifies a target can matter. Someone who later intimidates a witness can matter. The law recognizes those connections. That is one reason federal racketeering statutes can be powerful. They allow prosecutors to present a pattern rather than a single event. And the pattern was the heart of this case. The murders were not isolated. According to prosecutors, they were part of a broader pattern of criminal activity. That pattern stretched across years. Then came the arrests. In April 2018, law enforcement moved against the defendants. The operation involved approximately 200 officers and agents, according to contemporary reporting. The scale of the operation reflected the seriousness of the allegations. This was not a routine arrest. The federal government was dismantling what it described as a criminal enterprise. For people in the Mission District, the announcement carried a strange sense of finality. The names were public. The allegations were public. The old murders were back in the news. But the families still had to wait. Because the legal process moves differently from the news cycle. Headlines last hours. Trials can last years. Evidence must be disclosed. Lawyers argue. Defendants negotiate. Courts rule. And victims' families remain in the audience, watching the system work at its own pace. That waiting can be another form of suffering. A family can hear that an arrest has been made and still have no certainty about the outcome. They can see a suspect's photograph and still wonder whether the person will ever admit what happened. They can hear prosecutors say murder and still have to wait for a court to determine guilt. That uncertainty continued after 2018. Then in 2023, the case moved toward resolution. 6 defendants pleaded guilty. Their admissions provided a level of clarity that had been missing for years. Eddie Urbina admitted to the September 4, 2008 shooting. Jonathan Aguilar admitted to the March 14, 2006 shooting. Other defendants acknowledged roles in the criminal enterprise and its violent activities. The story was no longer simply an allegation. It was becoming a record of admissions in federal court. And then came the sentences. 32 years. 30 years. 25 years. 25 years. 22 years. 11 years. The numbers were announced in April 2024. 6 men. 6 prison sentences. The longest was 32 years. The shortest was 11. Together, they represented decades of punishment for a series of crimes that had begun almost 2 decades earlier. But no sentence can reverse a murder. That is the part statistics cannot express. A prison term can punish the offender. It cannot return the dead. It cannot erase the phone call. It cannot restore a family photograph to the future it once promised. It cannot return a person to a birthday that passed without them.
Justice quand arrive.
But it arrives late. And sometimes late justice is the only justice left. The San Francisco case also demonstrates something else. Cold cases do not always end with a dramatic discovery of a forgotten weapon. Sometimes the breakthrough is cumulative. Years of work. Different agencies. Different cases. Different suspects. A growing understanding of the organization. Then a federal indictment. Then pleas. Then sentences. No single moment explains everything. The investigation is the story. And the story is not really about 12 years. It is about what happened during those 12 years. The city changed. People changed. Investigators changed. Technology changed. But the murders remained. The victims remained. And the evidence remained waiting for someone to put it together. That is what makes a cold case so haunting. It is not truly asleep. It is waiting for the right question. Part 4. The most dangerous thing about a gang war is not always the number of people carrying guns. It is the logic behind the guns. An insult demands retaliation. A shooting demands another shooting. A death creates a debt. And the debt must be paid. According to federal prosecutors, that logic was embedded in the violence attributed to the 19th Street 16th Street Serenos. The gang was accused of using violence to protect territory and attack rivals. But territory is more than geography. It is identity. It is reputation. It is control. It is the ability to make other people afraid. That is why the Mission District became central to the investigation. The prosecutor's case described an enterprise operating within specific boundaries. One faction claimed territory roughly between 19th and 16th Streets, Folsom Street and Dolores Street. Another was centered around 16th Street and Mission Street. These were not abstract coordinates. They were real streets. Real homes. Real businesses. Real people. And according to the indictment, they became the stage for a long-running struggle. The violence did not necessarily announce itself. There were no front lines. No uniforms. No battlefield. Instead, investigators were dealing with ordinary city scenes suddenly transformed by gunfire. That creates a particular challenge. The crime scene disappears quickly. Blood is cleaned. Vehicles leave. Witnesses go home. Crowds scatter. Shell casings are collected. And the neighborhood returns to normal. But normal is an illusion. For the family of a murder victim, the street where the person died may never be normal again. A corner becomes a memory. A doorway becomes a warning. A certain date becomes impossible to forget. The federal investigation eventually brought those memories into one case. But the murders had different stories. Different victims. Different circumstances. The common threat prosecutors alleged was the enterprise. That is why the case became so significant. The government was not simply prosecuting individual acts. It was describing an ecosystem of violence. The enterprise allegedly involved narcotics, robberies, weapons, assaults, and murder. Violence was not an accident. According to prosecutors, it was a tool for enforcing rules, a tool for defending territory, a tool for intimidating rivals, a tool for maintaining status. And once violence becomes a tool, murder can become disturbingly routine. That is the part that investigators were trying to expose. The September 2008 killings illustrate the cycle. Earlier that day, a fellow Sereno had been murdered. Later, according to Urbina's admission, he and others retaliated. 2 people were killed. A third person was targeted but survived. The sequence was almost instantaneous. One death. Then another. Then another. The street had created its own clock. And every new shooting started the clock again. For investigators years later, the challenge was reconstructing the sequence. Who knew about the first murder? Who communicated afterward? Who organized the retaliation? Who provided the weapon? Who drove? Who fired? Who survived? Who was told to remain silent? Every question potentially connected another person. And the larger the network became, the more complicated the prosecution became. This is where federal investigators had an advantage. The case was not confined to one city's ordinary homicide investigation. HSI worked with local police. Federal prosecutors could use broader investigative tools. The goal was to demonstrate the existence of a criminal enterprise and the roles played by individual defendants. That strategy produced the 2018 indictment. 10 defendants. 7 murders. Years of alleged criminal activity. The numbers alone were shocking. But numbers do not capture fear. Fear is what keeps witnesses silent. Fear is what makes people lower their voices. Fear is what makes a person look over a shoulder before speaking. And fear is what allows criminal organizations to survive. The indictment alleged that gang members used distinctive tattoos and other symbols to promote their affiliation. It also alleged that members sold drugs, committed robberies, carried weapons, and participated in attacks on rivals. Each activity reinforced the others. Money supported the organization. Weapons supported the violence. Violence supported the reputation. Reputation supported control. Control supported the criminal business. That was the cycle prosecutors sought to break. And breaking a cycle is harder than arresting one person. Because if one person disappears, another can take his place. But if the structure is dismantled, the organization itself can weaken. That was the federal theory. The arrests in 2018 were therefore more than an attempt to solve old murders. They were an attempt to dismantle the organization allegedly responsible for them. The case also demonstrated why investigators sometimes revisit murders years later. A homicide that appears impossible in 2007 may become solvable in 2017. A suspect may cooperate. A witness may finally speak. A relationship may change. A defendant may decide that protecting someone else is no longer worth the consequences. And investigators may finally see connections that were invisible before. That is why cold cases can be deceptive. The case file may look frozen. The people connected to it are not. They continue to live. They argue. They commit other crimes. They make mistakes. They create new evidence. And every new event can cast light backward. For the San Francisco Serenos investigation, that backward light eventually reached the oldest murders. The March 2006 shooting. The September 2007 shooting. the September 2008 retaliation, the other killings that prosecutors connected to the enterprise. Each case became part of a larger timeline. And the timeline revealed something terrifying. The violence was not a single explosion. It was sustained. It had continuity. It had memory. And it had consequences. For the victims, those consequences were permanent. For the defendants, they eventually became federal prison sentences. For San Francisco, the story became another chapter in the city's long history of gang violence. But for investigators, the case offers something more important. Proof that old murders can still be prosecuted. Proof that time does not automatically erase evidence. Proof that a criminal enterprise can be pursued years after its most violent acts. And proof that the silence surrounding a murder can eventually break. The most dramatic moment was still ahead. Because the defendants would have to decide whether to fight the government's case. Or admit what they had done. And when they finally chose their path, the courtroom would hear details that had been hidden for years. Part 5. A courtroom is quieter than a crime scene. There is no flashing police light.
No ambulance siren.
No crowd running down a street. Only lawyers. Judges. Defendants. Documents. And words. But sometimes words are more powerful than gunfire. Because a guilty plea can do something an arrest cannot. It can create a permanent legal record. In October 2023, 6 defendants connected to the 19th Street 16th Street Serenos enterprise pleaded guilty to federal offenses tied to the criminal organization and 7 cold case murders. For families who had waited years, this was a turning point. The uncertainty was finally narrowing. The defendants were no longer merely people accused by prosecutors. They were admitting criminal conduct in federal court. The first major question was what each defendant had admitted. Eddie Urbina admitted the September 4, 2008 shooting. Jonathan Aguilar admitted the March 14, 2006 shooting. The admissions connected individual defendants to individual killings. That matters because racketeering cases can sometimes feel abstract. Enterprise. Conspiracy. Pattern. Those words describe structures. But murder is personal. 2 people killed in 2006 were not statistics. They were human beings. The same was true of the victims killed in 2008. And the other victims prosecutors connected to the enterprise. Every name represented a family. Every shooting represented a moment. Every death represented an absence that never ended. The federal government later described the case as involving 7 cold case murders that had occurred between 2006 and 2013. By 2024, the men who admitted their roles were facing the consequences. Sentences followed. Eddie Urbina received 32 years. Jonathan Aguilar received 30. Orlando Hernandez received 25 years, with 13 years consecutive to a prior 12-year sentence. Weston Venegas received 25 years, also with 13 years consecutive to a prior 12-year sentence. Juan Carlos Gallardo received 22 years. Mario Reyes received 11 years. The sentences were imposed in March and April 2024. The numbers were stark. But the story behind them was even darker. Urbina's admission included another disturbing detail. In 2015, prosecutors said, he attempted to reveal the identity of government witnesses to an incarcerated Sereno through a coded letter. That detail showed that the alleged enterprise was not simply a relic of the past. Even years after the murders, the network's influence could reach into prison. The investigation was dealing with more than old violence. It was dealing with an organization that prosecutors said had continued to operate through criminal relationships. That made the case more than a historical investigation. It was an attempt to stop continuing activity. And that is why federal authorities described the operation as a major law enforcement effort. The investigation involved HSI and police departments in San Francisco and Richmond. The arrests required coordination. The prosecution required years of preparation. The convictions required defendants to accept responsibility. The sentences finally placed the men behind bars. But there is an uncomfortable question. Does a conviction end a cold case? Legally, sometimes. Emotionally, never. For a family, there may still be unanswered questions. Why was my loved one targeted? Was he or she mistaken for someone else? Who else knew? What happened in the final minutes? Could the killing have been prevented? Those questions may never appear in a verdict. A court can determine guilt. It cannot reconstruct every second of a person's final day. That is the difference between legal truth and emotional truth. The legal record says what prosecutors proved or defendants admitted. The family may still carry questions that no courtroom can answer. And that is why the victims must remain at the center. The gang. The defendants. The arrests. The federal indictment. The prison sentences. All of these are important. But they are consequences. The beginning of every case was a person who died. A person who did not wake up the next morning. A person whose family had to learn how to live without them. That human cost is easy to lose when a case becomes a headline. 7 cold case murders. 10 defendants. 6 guilty pleas. 6 sentences. 32 years. 30 years. 25. 25. 22. 11. Numbers make a clean headline. Grief does not. Grief has no sentence. It does not end when the judge leaves the courtroom. It does not disappear when the defendant is transported to prison. It remains. And perhaps that is why cold cases continue to haunt communities even after they are solved. Because solving a murder is not the same as undoing it. San Francisco had changed since 2006. The neighborhoods changed. The people changed. The technology changed. But the families carried the same memories. That is the strange power of time. It changes everything except the fact that someone is gone. For investigators, however, the case proved that time could work in their favor. The defendants who once may have believed that the passage of years protected them eventually found themselves facing federal charges. The alleged enterprise that had operated in the Mission District became the subject of a massive prosecution. And the old murders became central evidence. The cold case had not disappeared. It had been waiting for the right investigation. There was another important lesson. The federal prosecution did not emerge from nowhere. It followed years of local police work. San Francisco homicide investigators had worked the killings. Gang investigators had gathered intelligence. Federal agents developed the broader enterprise theory. Different agencies contributed different pieces. Eventually, those pieces formed a case. This is how complex investigations often work. No single detective sees everything. No single report contains the whole truth. One investigator may know a victim. Another may know a suspect. Another may understand the gang. Another may understand the federal law. Another may have the evidence that connects them. The case becomes solvable when those fragments meet. That is what happened here. And when the pieces finally connected, the result was enormous. 7 murders. A criminal enterprise. A series of federal charges. Multiple arrests. Guilty pleas. Decades in prison. The story that had once seemed buried beneath 12 years of silence became one of the most significant gang-related cold case prosecutions in San Francisco in that period. But the case still leaves a final question. How many crimes remain hidden because nobody has yet connected the pieces? How many families are still waiting? How many witnesses still carry secrets? How many old files are sitting inside evidence rooms? And how many killers believe that time has already erased their crimes? The San Francisco case offers one answer. Time is not a guarantee. Silence is not immunity. And a murder does not necessarily become less important because the calendar moves forward. Sometimes the past comes back. Sometimes it arrives with federal agents at dawn. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a sealed indictment. Sometimes it arrives as a guilty plea. And sometimes, after years of waiting, it arrives in a courtroom as a sentence measured in decades. Part 6. The most haunting thing about the case is not the violence itself. It is the repetition. The same cycle appearing again and again. Arrival. A perceived insult. A shooting. A death. Retaliation. Another shooting. Another death. The federal indictment described the alleged enterprise as using violence to enforce its rules and attack rival gang members, particularly members of Norteño gangs. In that world, violence could become a language. A warning. A message. A demonstration. But every message had a recipient. Sometimes the recipient was a rival. Sometimes it was an entire neighborhood. And sometimes the message reached people who had nothing to do with the conflict. That is what makes gang violence different from a conventional dispute. The consequences spread. A person can be targeted because of a belief about who they are. A friend can be caught in the same shooting. A bystander can become a victim. A family can lose someone without ever understanding why they were chosen. And years later, investigators still have to answer the question. Why this person? The federal case provided answers in some incidents. Retaliation. Rivalry. Territory. Gang allegiance. But not every emotional question receives a legal answer. That is why the victims' stories remain important. The March 2006 shooting, for example, was not simply an event on a timeline. It was the beginning of a 12-year wait for accountability. When Jonathan Aguilar later admitted his role, the case moved from uncertainty to legal certainty. But that certainty came 17 years after the shooting. For the people waiting, 17 years is almost an entire generation. Children grow up. Parents grow old. Friends move away. Neighborhoods change. The dead remain exactly where they were left by history. That is the strange cruelty of a cold case. Everyone else gets older. The victim does not. The 2008 retaliation was even more revealing. A Sereno member was murdered earlier in the day. According to Urbina's admission, retaliation followed. 2 people were killed. Another was targeted. This was not random violence. It was violence operating according to a code. A brutal code. A code in which one death demanded another. Investigators later had to reconstruct not only the shooting itself, but the chain of events that led to it. Who knew about the earlier murder? How quickly did the information travel? Who decided retaliation was necessary? How were the victims selected? Who participated? And how did the perpetrators believe they could escape detection? Those questions reveal something important about organized violence. The murder is only the visible part. Behind it are conversations, relationships, planning, transportation, weapons, information, and sometimes intimidation. That hidden structure is what federal prosecutors sought to expose. The enterprise theory allowed them to connect crimes that occurred years apart. That made the prosecution more powerful. It also made the case more complicated. Because a jury or a judge reviewing a plea has to understand not just one shooting but the broader environment in which it happened. The government's evidence had to show how the defendants were connected to the organization, how the organization operated, how violence served its purposes, and how specific defendants participated in specific crimes. The eventual guilty pleas meant that 6 men accepted responsibility for offenses related to the enterprise. The case therefore avoided a long trial for those defendants. But the story remained on the record. Their admissions became part of the legal history, and their sentences became the final punctuation. For Urbina, 32 years. For Aguilar, 30. For Hernandez and Venegas, 25. For Gallardo, 22. For Reyes, 11. The prison terms reflected different roles and criminal histories. But collectively, they represented a dramatic shift from the uncertainty of the cold case years. In 2018, prosecutors were making allegations. In 2023, defendants were pleading guilty. In 2024, judges were imposing sentences. The timeline was finally moving. And that timeline reveals the importance of persistence. A murder does not become less important because it is old. A family does not stop caring because investigators have no immediate suspect. And a suspect does not become innocent simply because 12 years have passed. The passage of time can make prosecution harder. But it can also create new opportunities. People fall out. People confess. People cooperate. Technology improves. Investigators discover connections. And federal agencies can bring new resources to old cases. That is why cold case detectives often describe their work as unfinished business. The crime may be old. The obligation is not. The San Francisco investigation demonstrates that principle with unusual clarity. The murders were committed between 2006 and 2013. The federal indictment arrived in 2018. The guilty pleas came in 2023. The sentences came in 2024. Nearly 2 decades separated the earliest murder from the final prison sentences. That is a lifetime for some people. But it is also proof that the criminal justice system can move slowly without necessarily forgetting. There is another element that cannot be ignored. The neighborhood itself. Mission District residents were living alongside the alleged violence. Businesses opened every morning. People took public transportation. Families walked the streets. The community had to absorb the consequences of shootings and gang conflict. The federal government later said the enterprise had terrorized the Mission District for years through shootings, robberies, and drug dealing. Terrorized is a powerful word. It means the impact was larger than the victims named in the indictment. A shooting affects the family. A series of shootings affects a neighborhood. People begin to change behavior. Avoid certain streets. Avoid certain hours. Avoid certain people. They learn which conflicts not to mention. Fear becomes local knowledge. That is how criminal organizations maintain influence. Not only through violence, but through the expectation of violence. People do not have to see a gun every day. They only need to believe that someone might use one. That belief can be enough. And once fear becomes part of the neighborhood's daily life, removing the organization can take years. The 2018 arrests were therefore significant not only because suspects were taken into custody. They represented an attempt to break the expectation that the organization was untouchable. The message from prosecutors was direct. Old murders could still be prosecuted. Gang affiliation would not protect defendants. And federal resources could be brought against long-running criminal enterprises. That message mattered. Because organized crime depends on confidence. Confidence that members will stay loyal. Confidence that witnesses will remain silent. Confidence that police will never connect the cases. Confidence that time will erase evidence. The prosecution attacked that confidence. One guilty plea weakened the wall. Another created a new crack. Then another. Eventually, 6 men admitted their roles. The wall was no longer intact. The case had become a record. And records are difficult to erase. Part 7. There is a moment in every cold case when investigators stop asking, "Who did it?" and start asking, "How does everything connect?" That moment can change the entire investigation. The San Francisco Serenos case appears to have reached that point when investigators began treating the murders as manifestations of a larger criminal enterprise. The change was profound. A homicide detective looking at one murder sees one victim. A federal racketeering investigation can see an organization. The victim remains central. But the investigation expands. Who controlled the territory? Who sold drugs? Who carried weapons? Who attacked rivals? Who communicated with whom? Who had the authority to order violence? Who benefited? And who helped hide what happened? The answers create a network. Networks are difficult to understand until they are mapped. Once mapped, they can become evidence. The 2018 indictment did precisely that. It described an organization operating in the Mission District and connected its alleged activities to 7 murders. The defendants were not all accused of exactly the same conduct. Their alleged roles differed. Some were accused of murder. Some of conspiracy. One was accused of helping plan a hunt that led to a murder. That distinction matters. In organized crime, responsibility can exist at multiple levels. The person holding the gun is visible. The person who identifies the target may not be. The driver may disappear into the background. The person providing information may never approach the crime scene. The organization depends on all of them. That is why the investigation had to look beyond the trigger. It had to understand the system. The system allegedly operated through gang loyalty, Sereno identity, territory, rivalry, drug sales, retaliation, and fear. The Mexican Mafia's influence was also described by prosecutors as part of the broader Sereno structure. But the case was not about prison politics alone. It was about street-level violence. People living in San Francisco. People moving through neighborhoods. People caught in conflicts that could turn deadly. The federal case also included Richmond. That geographic connection mattered. The violence was not confined to one intersection. The alleged enterprise had relationships across the Bay Area. And that meant investigators had to work across jurisdictions. San Francisco Police, Richmond Police, Homeland Security investigations, federal prosecutors, different agencies, different databases, different investigators, different pieces of information. Cooperation became essential. The 2018 operation reflected that. Agents and officers moved simultaneously. Suspects were arrested in San Francisco and elsewhere. The scale prevented the investigation from being reduced to one suspect escaping while another was taken into custody. The operation was coordinated. The message was unmistakable. The federal government believed it was dismantling a network. But the most dramatic developments would come years later. The defendants faced the weight of the government's case. They had lawyers. They had rights. They could contest the allegations. But eventually, 6 pleaded guilty. A plea agreement is a moment of calculation. A defendant weighs the evidence, the potential sentence, the possibility of trial, the consequences for family, the likelihood of conviction, and the cost of continuing to fight. For investigators, a guilty plea can be the end of a long road. For victims' families, it can be the first moment when someone responsible finally says, in legal terms, "I did it." But the emotional experience is complicated. A plea can bring relief. It can also bring anger. Some families may want a trial. They may want every detail exposed. Others may prefer certainty without years of courtroom proceedings. There is no universal response. Justice is experienced differently by every family. The San Francisco case moved toward sentencing in 2024. The federal court imposed substantial prison terms. Urbina received 32 years. Aguilar received 30. Hernandez and Venegas each received 25. Gallardo received 22. Reyes received 11. These were not symbolic punishments. They were decades. The men would spend much of their remaining adult lives in prison. For prosecutors, the sentences represented accountability. For the families, they represented something more complicated. The people responsible were being punished. But the victims were still gone. That distinction is impossible to erase. A sentence can close a legal chapter, cannot close a life. And perhaps that is the reason cold cases remain so powerful in public memory. They force people to confront the difference between justice and restoration. Justice can punish. Restoration would require reversing time. No court can do that. The best a court can do is establish what happened and impose consequences. In this case, the consequences arrived years after the killings. The oldest murder dated to 2006. The first major federal indictment came in 2018. That is 12 years. Hence the headline. 12 years later, the case returned. But the phrase 12 years later can hide another truth. 12 years is also 12 years of uncertainty. 12 years of unanswered calls. 12 years of birthdays. 12 years of anniversaries. 12 years of families wondering whether the person responsible would ever face a judge. Cold case investigations are therefore not simply police stories. They are stories about time. And time has two faces. For investigators, time can create opportunities. For families, time can deepen grief. For suspects, time can create false confidence. For communities, time can bury memory. The challenge is to keep the case alive long enough for the truth to catch up. That is what happened here. The murders did not vanish. They accumulated. One case. Then another. Then another. Until the federal government could present them as part of a larger pattern. The case became a warning to anyone who believed gang violence was untouchable. It also became a warning to investigators not to abandon old files. Because the person who knows the truth may still be alive. The evidence may still exist. And the organization responsible may still be operating. The story of the San Francisco Serenos murders is therefore not simply a story of violence. It is a story of persistence. Of investigators returning to old evidence. Of agencies cooperating across jurisdictions. Of prosecutors constructing a federal case. Of defendants eventually admitting criminal conduct. And of families finally hearing that the people responsible would spend decades in prison. But one mystery remains beyond the reach of any sentence. What would those victims be doing today? The question has no answer. That is the final cruelty of murder. The dead cannot tell us who they would have become. Their futures were stolen. And no conviction can give those futures back. Part 8. By the time the sentences were announced in 2024, the case had traveled nearly 2 decades. The earliest murder was 17 years old. The investigation had survived changing detectives, changing neighborhoods, changing technology, changing defendants, changing relationships. The suspects themselves were no longer the same people they had been when the murders occurred. Age changes people. Prison changes people. Fear changes people. And guilt changes people. But the evidence remained. That is why the 2023 guilty pleas were so important. The defendants did not merely disappear into the legal system. They acknowledged crimes. Their admissions provided investigators, prosecutors, and families with answers that had been missing for years. Jonathan Aguilar's admission reached back to March 14, 2006. Eddie Urbina's reached back to September 4, 2008. Other defendants admitted conduct connected to the broader enterprise. The cases had become history. But history with names. History with victims. History with consequences. There is a temptation when telling a crime story to focus on the killers. Their nicknames. Their tattoos. Their weapons. Their alleged motives. Their prison sentences. But that can unintentionally give the offenders more attention than the victims. The better way to understand the case is to reverse the perspective. The killers were not the beginning. The victims were. The victims are the reason the investigation existed. The reason detectives returned to the files. The reason prosecutors built the case. The reason the federal government committed resources. And the reason the convictions mattered. Without the victims, there is no case. Only violence. That distinction should never be lost. The Mission District experienced years of alleged gang violence. But neighborhoods are not defined only by crime. People continued living, working, raising children, opening businesses, celebrating holidays. The violence was one part of the neighborhood's history, not the whole of it. Still, the killings left scars. A neighborhood can recover physically. Buildings can change. Streets can be renovated. Businesses can open. But memories remain. That is why prosecutors describe the criminal enterprise as having terrorized the Mission District. The word captures the psychological impact. Fear spreads beyond the people directly involved. A person hears about a shooting. Then another. Then another. Eventually, the violence becomes part of the mental map of the neighborhood. Certain streets become dangerous. Certain names become dangerous. Certain colors become dangerous. Certain conflicts become dangerous. The residents learn to navigate around them. That is how organized crime controls space. Not by standing on every corner, but by creating an invisible boundary. Cross it and there may be consequences. The federal case sought to remove that invisible boundary. By prosecuting the alleged organization, authorities were attacking the structure behind the violence. And the sentences sent another message. The past could still produce consequences. A person could not simply wait 12 years and assume the case had disappeared. That is one of the most important lessons from the investigation. Time is not the same thing as immunity. A cold case is not a dead case. It is an unresolved case. That difference matters. The 2018 indictment demonstrated that. The 2023 guilty pleas proved it. The 2024 sentences completed another stage. But the investigation also reminds us that justice is often uneven. Some people receive long prison sentences. Some victims' families receive answers. Some witnesses remain anonymous. Some details never become public. And some questions remain forever. That is normal in complex criminal cases. A courtroom cannot reveal everything. There may be evidence that remains sealed. There may be witnesses whose identities are protected. There may be allegations that are never tested because defendants plead guilty. There may be crimes that investigators suspect but cannot prove. The legal record is therefore only one layer of the truth. The community's memory is another. And the family's memories are another. Together they form the full story. The San Francisco Serenos investigation also shows why cooperation matters. Local police may know the neighborhood. Federal agents may have broader resources. Prosecutors understand federal statutes. Each side brings something different. When they work separately, connections can be missed. When they work together, old cases can be reopened with new energy. That cooperation was central to the prosecution. The Justice Department credited the investigation to HSI and police departments in San Francisco and Richmond. The operation was described as the product of a long-term investigation. Long-term is the key phrase, because the case did not emerge from a single breakthrough. It emerged from persistence. A detective keeps a name. Another investigator notices a connection. Prosecutor sees a pattern. A federal agency expands the investigation. A witness provides information. A defendant becomes vulnerable. And slowly the wall collapses. That process can be frustrating to the public. People want answers immediately. But complex criminal organizations rarely surrender their secrets quickly. The more people involved, the more difficult the case. The more years that pass, the more difficult the evidence. The more witnesses fear retaliation, the harder cooperation becomes. Yet the case demonstrates that persistence can overcome some of those barriers. It also demonstrates the importance of legal precision. The defendants were initially described as alleged participants. Only later did guilty pleas establish criminal responsibility for the conduct they admitted. That distinction matters in responsible crime reporting. A headline can say charged. A courtroom can say guilty. Those are not the same thing. The 2018 indictment was an accusation. The 2023 pleas changed the legal status. The 2024 sentences completed the punishment. For journalists, that timeline matters. For families, it matters even more. Because after years of hearing alleged, they finally heard the word that cold case families wait for. Accountability. But even that word has limits. It cannot resurrect the dead. It cannot restore childhood memories. It cannot remove the trauma of a shooting. It cannot erase the sound of a gunshot. It can only establish that the person responsible will face consequences. And sometimes that is the closest thing to closure the justice system can provide. The San Francisco case is therefore both a solved case and an unfinished human story. The legal questions have largely been answered for the 6 men who pleaded guilty. The emotional questions may never be. That is why the story continues to matter. Because cold cases are not really about the past. They are about the present. Every unanswered murder affects people today. Every missing answer creates another family living with uncertainty. Every solved case tells the families of other victims that an old file can still matter. That someone may still be looking. That the truth may still exist. And that time may not be enough to hide it. Part 9. There is a moment when a case stops being a mystery and becomes history. For the San Francisco Serenos murders, that moment came gradually. There was no single dramatic reveal. No hidden confession recorded in a dark room. No detective walking into a warehouse and finding the missing weapon. Instead, the case moved through the slow machinery of federal law. Indictment. Arrest. Evidence. Negotiation. Plea. Sentencing. Each step brought the truth closer. The first major public breakthrough came in 2018. Federal prosecutors unsealed an indictment naming 10 alleged members of the 19th Street 16th Street Serenos. The indictment described 7 murders between 2006 and 2013. For the public, the announcement was shocking. For investigators, it was the result of years of work. The old killings were finally being viewed together. That changed the meaning of every individual case. A shooting that seemed isolated could now be part of a pattern. A suspect who seemed peripheral could become important. A witness who seemed unreliable could possess information connecting multiple crimes. A nickname in one case could match a person in another. This is the power of pattern recognition. Criminal organizations create patterns because they repeat behavior. They repeat methods. They repeat relationships. They repeat motives. They repeat mistakes. And those repetitions leave traces. The 19th Street 16th Street Serenos case was built around those traces. The organization allegedly operated through a combination of criminal business and violence. Drug trafficking generated money. Robbery generated money. Violence generated fear. Fear protected territory. Territory protected business. The cycle reinforced itself. But every cycle creates evidence. People communicate. People travel. People meet. People use vehicles. People carry weapons. People talk. And sometimes people make mistakes. The investigation appears to have found enough connections to turn the old murders into a federal case. That does not mean every question was answered. It means enough evidence existed to establish criminal responsibility for the defendants who pleaded guilty. The distinction is crucial. A cold case can be solved without every mystery being solved. There may still be details nobody knows. There may still be people who never speak. There may still be evidence investigators cannot locate. But if the legal system can prove who committed a murder, accountability becomes possible. That happened here. The 6 defendants who pleaded guilty received substantial prison terms. The longest sentence, 32 years, went to Eddie Urbina. His admission to the 2008 shooting provided one of the clearest examples of the alleged retaliation cycle. A fellow Sereno was murdered earlier in the day. Later, Urbina and others killed 2 people and attempted to kill a third. The speed of the retaliation reveals the mindset investigators were confronting. There was no long reflection. No cooling-off period. The response was immediate. That is what makes gang retaliation so dangerous. The past becomes a command. A murder earlier in the day can determine who dies later that night. And the cycle can continue for years. Jonathan Aguilar's 30-year sentence was connected to his admitted role in the 2006 shooting and other criminal activity. The oldest murder in the case was therefore not forgotten. It became one of the foundations of the federal prosecution. Other defendants received sentences reflecting their roles and circumstances. The court's decisions demonstrated that a criminal enterprise is not necessarily treated as one indistinguishable mass. Individual conduct matters. Individual admissions matter. Individual histories matter. But the broader organization matters too. That balance is central to federal racketeering prosecutions. The government must show an enterprise. Then it must establish the defendant's relationship to that enterprise and the criminal acts involved. The San Francisco case presented a complex version of that structure. The gang factions were described as associated. The territory was described. The criminal activity was described. The murders were identified. The defendants were named. The indictment became a roadmap. And the guilty pleas later confirmed significant portions of that roadmap. For the families, the most important development was not the legal theory. It was the admission. Someone had finally acknowledged responsibility. That can be powerful. A family can stop wondering whether the person who killed their loved one will ever admit it. They can stop watching every new headline wondering if the case has gone cold again. They can finally know that the legal system has recognized what happened. But closure is not automatic. It is not a switch. It is not something a judge can order. A family may still experience grief years later. A parent may still keep a photograph. A sibling may still remember a voice. A friend may still replay the final conversation. The law can close a case. It cannot close memory. That is why the story should end where it began. With the victims. Not with the gang. Not with the defendants. Not with the federal government. The victims. People whose lives existed outside the crime. People who had plans. Relationships. Jobs. Friends. Families. The murders reduced those complex lives to a few lines in a legal document. The investigation tried to restore some of that complexity by establishing what happened. But a victim is always more than the way they died. That is something crime stories sometimes forget. The most powerful detail is not always the gun. It is the empty chair at a family table. The unanswered phone. The photograph that never gets updated. The birthday that becomes an anniversary of loss. The family member who keeps asking the same question. Why? In some cases the answer is found. In others it is not. The San Francisco Serenos case offers more answers than many cold cases receive. But even here there are limits. The legal system can establish responsibility. It cannot restore the future. That is why the case remains haunting. It shows both the strength and the limits of justice. Investigators can follow evidence for years. Prosecutors can build complex cases. Defendants can plead guilty. Judges can impose decades-long sentences. But none of that changes the original crime. The past remains the past. The only thing justice can do is reach into it. Name what happened. Name who was responsible. And impose consequences. That is what happened here. 12 years after the oldest murders, federal prosecutors brought the alleged enterprise into public view. 5 years later, defendants began pleading guilty. The following year, sentences were imposed. The timeline was long. But the case proved that long does not mean forgotten. Part 10. The final image is not a prison cell. It is a street. A San Francisco street at night. Cars moving. Lights glowing in apartment windows. People walking home. A city continuing. That is what cities do. They continue. Even after tragedy. Even after murder. Even after years of fear. The streets where violence occurred remain. Buildings remain. Intersections remain. But the people connected to the crimes may be gone. Some are dead. Some are in prison. Some moved away. Some became witnesses. Some became investigators. And some families remain behind, carrying memories that cannot be transferred to anyone else. The San Francisco Serenos case is a story of that persistence. The crimes occurred between 2006 and 2013. The federal government publicly charged 10 alleged participants in 2018. 6 eventually pleaded guilty. 6 were sentenced in 2024. The legal story reached a major conclusion. But the human story continued. That distinction is important. Because headlines tend to end when the judge speaks. Families do not. A sentence may be reported for one day. The grief can last for decades. The case also reveals something about how violence spreads. A gang does not need to control an entire city. It only needs to control enough space to create fear. Enough people to enforce loyalty. Enough money to support criminal activity. Enough weapons to make threats credible. And enough silence to keep outsiders from understanding what is happening. According to prosecutors, the 19th Street 16th Street Serenos operated through precisely that combination. The indictment described narcotics trafficking, robbery, weapons, assaults, murder, and violence against rivals. Each crime supported the broader organization. That was the government's central theory. The organization was not simply a collection of people who happened to know one another. It was alleged to function as an enterprise. That enterprise became the target. And the prosecution succeeded in bringing multiple defendants into federal court. The case also showed how law enforcement can use time against criminal organizations. People assume that time favors the suspect. Sometimes it does. Evidence disappears. Witnesses forget. People die. But time can also create fractures. Relationships change. Loyalty weakens. People who once shared secrets may no longer trust one another. Someone who once feared retaliation may eventually decide that the fear is no longer worth carrying. That is when old investigations can suddenly accelerate. The San Francisco case appears to demonstrate this dynamic. The arrests came after years of investigation. The pleas came after years of federal litigation. And the sentences came after defendants acknowledged their roles. The case did not explode into existence. It accumulated. Piece by piece. Year by year. Name by name. Eventually there was enough. Enough evidence. Enough connections. Enough admissions. Enough legal ground to bring the case to an end. But there is one part of the story that cannot be measured. Fear. The federal indictment alleged that violence was used to defend territory and enforce the gang's rules. That means the victims were not the only people affected. Witnesses were affected. Residents were affected. Families were affected. People who saw nothing may still have heard gunfire. People who knew something may have decided silence was safer. That invisible impact is one of the defining characteristics of organized crime. A criminal organization does not need to threaten everyone individually. People learn from what happens to others. One murder becomes a warning to 100 people. One retaliation becomes a lesson. One shooting creates silence. That is how fear travels. And that is why dismantling an organization matters. The goal is not only to punish people for past crimes. It is to reduce the possibility of future violence. The sentences imposed in 2024 therefore represented more than punishment for old murders. They also marked the end of a long federal effort to hold members of the alleged enterprise accountable. The Justice Department emphasized that the case demonstrated its willingness to pursue gang violence, regardless of how much time had passed. That message is important for cold cases everywhere. The calendar does not decide whether a murder matters. Evidence does. Law does. Persistence does. And sometimes a case that appears impossible can change because one piece finally moves. A witness talks. A suspect confesses. An investigator sees a connection. Prosecutor builds a theory. A defendant pleads guilty. The sequence can be slow, but it can work. The San Francisco case is therefore not really a story about 12 years. It is a story about what happened after 12 years. The oldest murders survived the passage of time. They survived changes in the neighborhood. They survived changes in the people involved. They survived the years when the public had stopped talking about them. Then they returned. And when they returned, they brought consequences. The men involved faced decades in federal prison. Their names entered the permanent court record. Their admissions became evidence. The victims' families finally saw the justice system move. But the final truth is harder. No sentence can bring back a victim. No indictment can restore a family. No guilty plea can erase a crime. Justice can only acknowledge what happened. And sometimes that acknowledgement is the most important thing left. Because the opposite of justice is not only innocence. It is forgetting. A cold case becomes truly dangerous when the world forgets that the victim ever existed. The San Francisco murders were not forgotten. They remained in police files. They remained in federal investigations. They remained in the memories of families. And eventually they returned to the public record. That is why the case matters today. Not because gang violence is mysterious. Not because murder is unusual. But because a case that once seemed buried beneath 12 years of silence became a federal prosecution involving multiple murders and multiple defendants. It is a reminder that the passage of time can conceal a crime, But it cannot necessarily erase it. The city keeps moving. The streets keep changing. New headlines replace old ones. But somewhere beneath the noise is a family still remembering. A photograph. A voice. A face. A life. And the knowledge that the person they loved was not forgotten. Part 11. Years after the final gunshot, the streets are quiet. Not silent. Never silent. San Francisco is too alive for silence. Traffic passes. Doors open. People laugh. Music comes through windows. A bus moves down the street. Someone turns a key in an apartment door. A restaurant closes for the night. A streetlight flickers. And somewhere someone remembers. That is where every cold case ultimately ends. Not with the police tape. Not with the indictment. Not with the prison sentence. With memory. The San Francisco Serenos case began with murders. It grew into an investigation. Then an indictment. Then arrests. Then guilty pleas. Then sentences. The legal story is clear enough. Federal prosecutors alleged that the 19th Street 16th Street Serenos operated as a criminal enterprise in the Mission District, using violence, drug trafficking, robbery and other crimes to maintain influence and attack rivals. The indictment connected the enterprise to 7 murders committed between 2006 and 2013. In 2018, the investigation became public. 10 defendants were charged. The old murders returned to the headlines. For families, the headlines were both painful and hopeful. Painful because the deaths were being discussed again. Hopeful because the people accused of causing them were finally facing federal charges. Then came the long legal process. Years passed. The defendants remained in the system. The evidence was tested. The government prepared. And in 2023, 6 defendants pleaded guilty. The cold case had finally crossed a line. It was no longer only an investigation. It was a series of admissions. Then came 2024. The sentences. 32 years. 30. 25. 25. 22. 11. 6 men. 6 prison terms. Decades of consequences. The Justice Department described the sentences as accountability for participation in the criminal enterprise and the 7 cold case murders. But the word accountability can never be separated from the word loss. Because every year of a prison sentence represents something different from every year stolen from a victim. A defendant can eventually leave prison. A victim cannot return. That is the permanent imbalance created by murder. The case also leaves a warning. Not every cold case will end this way. Not every family will receive answers. Not every witness will come forward. Not every organization will be dismantled. Not every murder will produce a guilty plea. But this case demonstrates what can happen when investigators refuse to let time become an excuse. The oldest murder was more than a decade old when the federal indictment was unsealed. That alone was remarkable. 12 years had passed. Yet the evidence still mattered. The people involved were still identifiable. The organization could still be reconstructed. And the government could still bring charges. That is the real lesson. Cold does not mean dead. Old does not mean forgotten. Unsolved does not mean unsolvable. And silence does not necessarily last forever. For the victims' families, the years before the arrests must have felt endless. There is a particular cruelty in waiting for justice. You cannot schedule it. You cannot force it. You can only hope. Hope that investigators are still working. Hope that someone will remember. Hope that a witness will speak. Hope that a suspect will make a mistake. Hope that the next phone call will bring answers instead of disappointment. The 2018 arrests changed that waiting. For the first time, there were names. There were charges. There was a federal case. And there was a path toward accountability. The guilty pleas in 2023 changed it again. The people involved were acknowledging criminal conduct. The sentences in 2024 brought another form of finality. But finality is not closure. Closure is a personal thing. For some families, knowing that the killers are in prison may bring peace. For others, it may not be enough. Some may still want to know every detail. Some may still ask why. Some may still wonder what happened in the final minutes. And some may simply miss the person. No courtroom can answer all of that. The law can say who was responsible, can say what crimes were committed, can impose punishment. But grief belongs to the family. Memory belongs to the family. And the dead belong to history. That is why the final image of this story should not be a gang symbol. It should not be a prison gate. It should not be a courtroom. It should be an empty place at a table. A photograph on a wall. A name spoken quietly. A family member remembering a person as they were before the murder. Before the headlines. Before the police tape. Before the case number. Before the word victim. Because every victim was once something else first.
À son.
A daughter. A brother. A sister. Parent. A friend. A neighbor. A human being with a future. That future ended. The investigation did not restore it. The convictions did not restore it. The prison sentences did not restore it. But the investigation did something important. It refused to allow the murders to disappear. That is the purpose of a cold case investigation at its best. Not spectacle. Not revenge. Memory. Evidence. Accountability. The San Francisco case demonstrates that a murder can remain relevant long after the cameras leave. A file can sit for years. A family can wait. A detective can retire. A new detective can reopen the file. And suddenly the past becomes present again. The streets may look different. The people may look different. But the questions remain. Who did it? Why? Who helped? Who knew? And will anyone ever answer? In this case, some of those questions were answered. The federal prosecution established criminal responsibility for the defendants who pleaded guilty. The sentences placed them behind bars for decades. But not every mystery disappears. Not every wound closes. And not every family stops remembering. That is why this case should never be reduced to a list of gang names and prison sentences. The real story is the passage of time. 12 years. 17 years. Nearly 2 decades. Years in which the world continued while families waited. Years in which suspects aged. Years in which evidence remained. Years in which the victims' names could have faded. But they did not. And that may be the most powerful fact of all. The murders were not forgotten. They were waiting. Waiting for investigators to connect the dots. Waiting for the justice system to catch up. Waiting for the truth to survive the people who tried to bury it. Eventually it did. The case that once seemed cold became a federal prosecution. The suspects who once seemed beyond reach went to prison. The families who had waited received answers. And San Francisco moved forward. But beneath the movement of the city, the past remains. 7 murders. Years of violence. A criminal enterprise. A 12-year journey from the oldest killings to the federal charges. And nearly 2 decades before the final sentences. The streets have changed. The headlines have changed. The people have changed. But one fact has not. A murder does not disappear because the world stops talking about it. It remains. In a case file. In a photograph. In a family memory. In a neighborhood. And sometimes, years later, it returns with the force of a headline that nobody expected to read again. 12 years later, the old murders came back. And when they did, they brought the past into the courtroom. The silence finally broke. The defendants finally faced consequences. But for the families, the silence will never be completely gone. Because when a person is murdered, the world loses more than a life. It loses every future that person would have lived. Every conversation. Every birthday. Every ordinary morning. Every possibility. Those things cannot be sentenced. They cannot be recovered. They cannot be returned. All that remains is memory. And memory, unlike a criminal case, has no closing date. The city will keep moving. The streets will keep changing. New generations will walk where old violence once occurred. Most will never know what happened there. But somewhere a family will remember. And somewhere in the permanent record of the city, the names of the dead remain. Not as statistics. Not as gang victims. Not as case numbers. But as people. People whose lives ended in violence. People whose families waited. People whose stories survived. And people whose deaths finally forced a 12-year-old mystery back into the light. That is the legacy of the San Francisco Serenos cold case murders. Not simply that killers went to prison. But that time failed to erase the victims. And after all those years, that may be the most important verdict of all. The city does not announce when it has forgotten. There is no ceremony. No final siren. No newspaper headline saying that the last memory has disappeared. Instead, forgetting happens quietly. A photograph is placed inside a drawer. A name is spoken less often. A street changes. A business closes. A new building rises where an old one once stood. And eventually, people who were not there begin walking through places where terrible things happen without knowing what occurred. That is why cold cases matter. They are not simply investigations waiting for police to solve them. They are fragments of memory waiting for someone to preserve them. The San Francisco Serenos case became one of those fragments. The violence belonged to another era of the city. The earliest murders were committed in 2006. The latest killings included in the federal indictment occurred in 2013. By the time federal authorities announced the charges in 2018, the oldest crimes were already more than a decade old. Some of the victims had been gone for so long that younger people in the neighborhood might never have known they existed. But their families knew. Their friends knew. And somewhere inside law enforcement files, their names remained. That is what separates a cold case from a forgotten case. A forgotten case has no one left looking. A cold case still has someone asking questions. The investigators who worked this case were not searching for a dramatic ending. They were searching for connections. Connections between people. Connections between shootings. Connections between gang activity and violence. Connections between old evidence and new information. That process is slow. Can be painfully slow. But organized crime is built on connections. And connections leave traces. A person does not join an organization in complete isolation. There are friendships.
Association.
Shared territory. Shared enemies. Shared sources of money. Shared weapons. Shared information. The same names appear repeatedly. The same neighborhoods appear repeatedly. The same conflicts appear repeatedly. And eventually, investigators can begin to see a pattern that was invisible, when each crime was examined alone. That pattern became the foundation of the federal case. The government alleged that the 19th Street 16th Street Serenos operated as a criminal enterprise. The organization was allegedly involved in drug trafficking and robbery. But violence was at the center of the prosecution. Violence against rivals. Violence used for retaliation. Violence used to maintain reputation. And, according to prosecutors, violence used to protect the organization itself. The murder cases were therefore not isolated tragedies. They became evidence of how the alleged enterprise functioned. That is why the passage of time ultimately worked against the defendants. Every year created more history. Every history created more evidence. Every relationship became another potential connection. And every connection could be examined. The defendants may have believed that the distance between 2006 and 2018 was protection. It was not. The federal indictment closed that distance instantly. Names that had once existed only in investigative files became public. Old allegations became federal charges. And the murders became part of a much larger story. But an indictment is only the beginning. The government still had to prove its case. The defendants had to make decisions. Would they fight? Would they negotiate? Would they remain silent? Would they accept responsibility? For 5 years, the legal process continued. Then, in October 2023, 6 defendants pleaded guilty. That moment changed the case permanently. The legal system no longer depended entirely on proving every allegation through a jury trial. The defendants had acknowledged criminal conduct. And the admissions reached backward through time. Back to shootings that families had been waiting years to understand. Back to streets where evidence had long since disappeared. Back to nights that witnesses had tried to forget. One admission could illuminate an old crime. Another could reveal a different connection. And together, the pleas created a clearer picture of the organization prosecutors had described. The prison sentences that followed in 2024 were severe. But they also represented something symbolic. For years, the defendants had existed outside the final judgment of the court. Then the judge pronounced the sentences. The uncertainty ended. For the people responsible, the future became measured in prison years. For the families, the future remained measured in memories. Those two timelines would never be equal. That is one of the hardest truths in every murder case. The criminal may eventually walk out of prison. The victim never walks out of the grave. The punishment can be long. The loss is permanent. And that is why the word closure should be used carefully. There is no single moment when grief ends. A conviction can provide answers. A guilty plea can confirm responsibility. A sentence can provide accountability. But grief does not follow the calendar of a court. It follows the calendar of the family. A birthday. A wedding. A holiday. An anniversary. A photograph. A song. A familiar street. Any ordinary detail can reopen an old wound. The victims remain present through memory. That is why the story should not end with the prison doors closing. It should end with the city continuing. Because that is what happened. San Francisco continued. People went to work. Children grew up. Buildings changed. Neighborhoods evolved. New crimes replaced old headlines. But underneath that movement was a history that could not be erased. 7 murders. A criminal enterprise. Years of gang conflict. 12 years before federal charges were publicly announced. And nearly 2 decades before the oldest killings reached the final stage of sentencing. That timeline should be uncomfortable. Because it reminds us how long justice can take. It also reminds us how long families can wait. A murder happens in seconds. The investigation can take years. The trial can take years. The grief can last forever. That is the imbalance. One moment destroys a life. The justice system may spend decades trying to understand that moment. The San Francisco case also illustrates the importance of separating allegations from proven facts. When the indictment was announced, prosecutors described the defendants as alleged members of the criminal enterprise. That was the government's accusation. The legal process came afterward. Only the guilty pleas established criminal responsibility for the conduct those defendants admitted. That distinction is essential. Because sensational crime stories can easily turn suspicion into certainty. Responsible reporting does not. It follows the timeline. Charge. Evidence. Plea. Sentence. Each stage means something different. And in this case, each stage brought the families closer to an answer. The investigation also revealed the complexity of gang-related homicide. The motive is not always money. It may be reputation, territory, retaliation, identity, fear. A person can become a target because another person believes they belong to an enemy group. That belief can be enough. The victim may not understand the accusation. The victim may not even know the person who wants them dead. But in the logic of gang retaliation, perception can become reality. And once someone is labeled an enemy, the label can become a death sentence. That is what makes these cases so difficult. Investigators must understand not only the crime, but the culture surrounding it. The relationships. The rivalries. The symbols. The territory. The hierarchy. The language. The history. Without that context, a murder may appear random. With it, investigators can begin to understand why multiple crimes occurred in the same environment. That understanding helped transform 7 separate murders into one federal case. And once the pattern became visible, the past became much harder to hide. The case also demonstrates another uncomfortable reality. Sometimes the person who knows the truth is not the person police expect. It may be someone close to the suspect, someone inside the organization, someone who participated in one crime but knew about another, someone who was once loyal and later became afraid, someone whose own legal problems made cooperation possible. Cold cases can turn on those human fractures. Organizations depend on loyalty. But loyalty has limits. People change. Relationships break. Fear moves in both directions. The same organization that once made a person feel protected can eventually make that person feel trapped. And when that happens, secrets can escape. The San Francisco investigation eventually broke through the silence. Not all of it. No investigation ever uncovers everything. But enough. Enough to identify defendants. Enough to bring charges. Enough to obtain guilty pleas. Enough to impose decades of imprisonment. That is the measure of the case. Not that every mystery disappeared, but that the victims were no longer waiting for the justice system to begin. It had begun. It had reached them. And it had reached the people responsible. Years from now, most people walking through the Mission District will not know the details. They will see streets, buildings, traffic, ordinary life. But somewhere beneath that ordinary life is a history of violence that once seemed impossible to unravel. The history is preserved in court records, in police reports, in federal filings, in the memories of families, and in the sentences imposed on the men who pleaded guilty. That is how a cold case survives. Not through fear. Through evidence. Not through rumors. Through records. Not through mythology. Through facts established in court. The case began in darkness. It moved through years of uncertainty. Then it entered the light of a federal courtroom. And the final image is not a killer. It is not a weapon. It is not a gang symbol. It is a family photograph. A face looking into the camera. Person smiling. A life before the violence. Before the crime scene. Before the case number. Before the word murder. That is the image that should remain. Because the greatest victory in a cold case is not simply putting someone behind bars. It is preventing the victim from becoming forgotten. And after all those years, that did not happen. The city moved forward. The headlines changed. The defendants were sentenced. But the names of the victims remained. The past had finally spoken. And this time the city listened.